Right, we got a pile of parts here on the bench to go in the 928. Main thing we're doing is motor mounts. We got a pair of Volvo mounts that should fit in the place of the original ones. The difference is this little pin at the top there. But I think some people grind it off. We might be able to put a little hole in the top of the mount for it to, or in the where it bolts into the crossmember engine mount bracket, so it can help locate it. But we'll do something about that there. But I mean, it's the ones that a lot of people use because they're a lot cheaper than the $300 Porsche ones, or $300 a piece. These are about $60 for the pair. We got then other things we're gonna have to take apart partially to to get to the engine mounts is steering rack. So we got steering rack bushings, we got sway bar bushings. Both of the bushings on the rack and the sway bars are kind of past it a bit. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do while we're down there too is oil pan gasket's leaking a bit, or seeping a bit, so now's a good time to get to that because the only other thing that's going to be in the way is the starter. So we'll get that out and change this one, new silicone one instead of the cork one, and hopefully that'll seal up a bit better. And then while we have the pan off, we also got new gasket for the, now I might mix these up which one's which, but one of these is for the oil level sensor and one of them's the block off plate for where there was a vent tube, I think, with the 16 valve motors, but the 32 valve motor doesn't have it. And we got what I believe this is the sealing ring for the oil pan pickup, a little boot for the oil level sensor, and then apparently with the 928 it's common practice to inspect at least the number 2 and 6 cylinder rod bearings, which for me, 2 and 6, the way Porsche numbers it, that's 3 and 6, no, 3 and 4. The way Porsche numbers it, that's 3 and 4 on a Chevy or a Chrysler V8. That's how I think of it. And then this is some hardware for the engine mount and sealing rings for the oil pan drain plug. Alright, we're down here under the Porsche land. You can see here's on the driver's side, there's the engine mount there. See if we can get yeah, there we go. It's the engine mount there, and you can see it sits on the cross member there, so we're going to have to, well, the first thing we need to do is get the wheels off, and we'll get to the rack lowered. So we got to take this plate off, get the rack lowered. We'll got to get the sway bar out of the way. Of course, we'll go up there, we'll make sure we'll use our rig or brace to hold up the engine. And then we can start working on unbolting this cross member, which shares a couple bolts with the lower control arms on the front, so we gotta undo those. And then I think that'll get us everything we need to get to the motor mount. But then, since we're going a step further, we'll be taking the starter off so we can get to the pan bolts there and lower the pan. And we'll probably end up removing the alternator because it's a bit of a squeeze up there to those bolts. And we'll probably at least unbolt. We'll unbolt and swing out of the way the... Well, actually, we might not need to move the AC compressor. It can probably stay put. It's pretty good access to these bolts here, and you can see the motor mount on the passenger side. Of course, we'll clean things up a bit too because they're a bit greasy. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get the engine raised up just a hair. Both of these bolt at the front and the one at the back, they're both just, kind of taut on the engine mount lift point. So we're just going to give it a couple cranks, and we put a piece of tape on there so we can get an idea for how high we're lifting. But just give it a couple turns just to relieve any pressure from the rack, or not the rack, the cross member, hopefully. So there we got about a thread exposed. And this is, yeah, good and tight. So we'll do that. We're not going to do too much because the motor mount bolts are still tight. About the same. Looks like same thing. We got the sway bar. The way we removed the bolts holding it to the, I guess, the frame of the car. And now we got to loosen the bolts on the drop link there. And hopefully then it can swing out of the way. Then we can get on with getting the rack plate out. Alright, so with that absolute pain of a sway bar bolt loose on both sides, those things were stupidly tight. One bolt out of there from the rack plate, bagged and tagged. We'll get those small ones out, and then we'll get the big ones out. Have to hold up above where the other side of the bolt is, and hopefully then we can get the rack maneuvered around enough to give us some room. Okay, our rack plate is off in there, and we got the rack loose. So it's still attached to the steering shaft, which is holding bulk of the weight of it, I'm sure, and the lines are still attached to it. So hopefully we can do this without having to really detach it. Loosening or disconnecting a tie rod from the knuckles, no big deal, but hopefully this will give us, you know, enough. Oh yeah, that'll work. Yeah, so that'll, you know, get out of the way enough that we can get to the motor mount bolt, which is covered in spider eggs. Lovely. And get the cross member out of the way. So while we got the rack loose, since I have new bushings to put on it, and these are Delrin ones from Roger at 928 RS, but these old ones, they some people say they can be annoying to get out, but well, the inner sleeve pretty much pushed out of that one, and honestly the rubber doesn't seem like it's in there super good. We're saying push it out with a clamp, but honestly I think it'll just push out. Yeah. So it's definitely old, but not really stuck in there like some people said they did, and I'll, you know, clean it out before I put these in for good, but yeah, there's, okay, we're definitely gonna need a clamp to push them in. But yeah, the old ones came out pretty easy, at least that one did. You know, there's 3 more. So it turns out my rack did not have any outer sleeves on the bushings. That's all that came out, and there's no metal sleeve in there like there's supposed to be. Okay, the mount bolts on the bottom there are loosened where they go in the cross member. So now that they're loose, we're gonna get the bolts out from the bracket to the block, and then we'll lift it up a bit. The bolts holding the mount brackets to the block are out now. All of them are out. Can't really see over there. So motor mount bolts are loose, so we're gonna lift up top on the engine a bit. Alright, so we're lifted up about 3/4 of an inch so far. So we're gonna go down and inspect a couple things. We're gonna check on the oxygen sensor for one, which I don't know if it'll show up on camera too well because it's all the way up there. But I'll see if I can hold it up there, but it looks like it's clear so far. Cross member is still completely bolted down, so the engine ain't going anywhere, even though it's separate from the mounts right now. So you can see the only thing holding holding up the engine right now is the bracing up top. Alright, so this upper bolt on the driver's side of the cross member is kind of a pain to get to. So what we've done here, we got a socket on the bolt, on the nut, rather. Winding it out now. Alright, so right now getting the control arm off, or the lower control arm unbolted at least, is the pretty much the last step before getting the cross member out. So we took one of the tow hook bolts out and loosened the other, and we can get the control arm bolts out. Now we're down to one bolt on each side for the cross member, I think. Yeah, there we go. There's the other side came easy, and there's plenty of room for the impact. This side's not coming easy, and there's no room for the impact. Yeah, these things are kind of in the way a bit. Tube out of the way so it doesn't get squished anymore. There's another rack, not rack, engine mount plate. Of course the engine mount is in the way still. There we go. One mount out of the damn way. Now, cross member, come out, please. There's that. We've got a cross member out. It's dirty, so it's going to need cleaned up. Alright, so the cross member's out. It's dirty, so we'll have to clean that up. I think we'll clean that up tomorrow. We'll pressure wash it outside. So, we got access to everything down here now. It's really greasy. So we're going to do the oil pan gasket while we have everything apart and access to it down here. So guess we'll take the alternator out to get to those couple bolts and take the starter off. And then that can get us the oil pan gasket. Alright, so we've got the old mounts up here on the table, and we got new mounts up here for comparison, but straight away you can see these things were worn out. That's metal rubbing there. It was in the bracket like that, so it's rubbing metal of the bracket, so that's the engine side of it. And I'm pretty sure that's the same piece of metal here through it. So really, these things were pretty much, the engine was metal on metal to the chassis of the car. So vibrations would have been coming right through. So it's not that surprising that we had some vibrations in the car. And just so we can see too, here they are side by side. So here's the mating surface of the new one and the mating surface of the old one there. So see, we've done a little bit of cleaning up some of the grease on this top of the motor. We didn't worry too much about the pan since we'll be taking that out and can clean it up then, but the starter's down so we can get it out. So now I guess we just need to get the alternator out and then we can start unbolting the pan. Gotta drain the oil still too, that'd probably be good. Get the oil drain plug out. And of course it goes all over me. Well, we got the alternator sitting down here in the ground, so we pretty much got access all the way around to the hand bolts. Some of them up front are a little annoying to get to, but for the most part, looks like we should be good. So we'll start getting them wound out. Okay, Okay, the oil pan is completely unbolted. Right now it's just resting on the floor jack I put under there so it didn't come crashing down. So now we just gotta lower it down. I guess the tricky thing is doing this without making a massive mess, but it's a good bit of oil on top of there. Alright, well, the pan is off. See the bottom of the motor here. Nothing that screams awful. Alright, now that the oil pan's all cleaned up, we can go ahead and get the new gaskets for the oil level sender and this block-off plate on. Okay, here we got the rod bearing off of, I forget which one it is already. It's either, okay, the Porsche numbering confuses me. It's 2 and 5. It's one of those two on the second journal because they're numbered oddly. It's, 3 and 4 on a normally numbered engine. It's not a Ford. But I'd say they look pretty good. It doesn't really look like they've been hot, so I think they're good to go back. And lots apart, here's a look at the crank journal. We already did the other one on this journal, so we'll get the bearing put back in, the cap on, and start with cleaning up things to get the oil pan back on. So we're finally putting stuff back together on the car. Alright, that bearing's back in there now. I didn't want to risk trying to do it with one hand and holding the camera and drop it or anything, but yeah. For an indicated 230 something thousand miles, the side of this engine looks pretty good. So we'll get the other half of the bearing and the end cap back on. Okay, and I've just turned these by hand until the cap is seated, so we'll get the torque wrench and get these tightened. We'll just do a little bit at a time on each of these. Okay, I'm going to set the camera down, but you get the point. Alright, so we got the pan ready to go back on with the new gasket. So we've got a couple zip ties around here just to keep the gasket in place, and once we get enough bolts in around, just not tight, but just enough to keep the gasket from sliding out, we'll cut those and pull them out. So we'll go ahead and get this lifted up. Alright, so there's one of the zip ties we put on to the gasket in place. So the bolts around it are so thin, so we'll pull it out and we'll get fresh bolt down here and get a drop of blue Loctite on it. Shouldn't get a ton of this one. And, yep. Through the gasket. On in. Alright, all the bolts for the pan are in place, so now I just got to go around and tighten them. Alright, oil pan's back on. Starter is back on too now. So we're going to go ahead and get the upper control arm for the driver's side ready to go on, and I think we'll do that while access to it looks a bit easier with the crossmember out of the way. So we'll do that, and we'll get back with getting the engine mounts back in. Alright, so here's one of the old motor mounts, and you see it's got just the top part. It sits. This is the orientation it would be on the motor. So it that's the top there, and it's got that square area so it holds it still so you can tighten it. And then this washer goes on the bottom, and I guess these two little loops there sit like that, which I guess if it was a new mount would be up closer to there. So one of the things we've run into now with the new mounts is that, set this here, so it doesn't have the square area, it just has a pin. So I went ahead and drilled a hole in the top of the bracket so it'll hold this in there, and it holds it in the same orientation as the original one. The problem it does leave us, though, is that this new mount is enough taller than the old one that we can't really get the washer in there too well. We're going to wind up with metal to metal contact between this part that's going to be sitting on the cross member and this part that's bolted to the motor, I think. So after some quick Google foo, it seems like just the weight of the engine on here will be enough to squish it down so that this isn't touching. So we'll it's annoying because the only way to try it is to get the cross member bolted in and see if it fits, and if not, then have to lift it back up again and try again. But I guess we'll give it a shot and see what we wind up with. Alright, so engine mounts are set in place on both sides, and just got 2 bolts just started just to keep them in, because we probably need to move them around a little bit to get them in the cross member, but now it's time to wrestle the cross member in. Alright, so the cross member's mostly in place. Just got to kind of finagle it around to get the motor mount bolts through it, but we're getting close. Alright, the bolts are in the motor mounts now. So now we can get the cross member bolted back in. Alright, so the cross member has a bolt on each side holding it up, so it's now in place. Alright, it's pretty much at the height it's going to be at. The motor's still being held up from above by the braces, of course, but already, with the weight of the motor still being mostly held up by those braces, you can see just that weight of the cross member pulling, or the force of the cross member pulling up. We've got the mount plates, or whatever those washers are, they're not touching. In fact, let me see, it's not going to wiggle because it's tight, but yeah. So that's collapsed enough that it's, or compressed rather, that it's not on there, so that's good. So now we just got to get the rest of the bolts and everything, get the rack bolted up, and can start getting things back together here. Alright, so now we got the control arms on both sides, got the bolts started, and need to wind them in most of the way over here. Now the front section of the lower control arm here, the bushing's completely contained in that guy there. So that means that it, whenever we bolt it in, it's forcing itself to where it wants to sit naturally. This one, on the other hand, isn't. This is actually the outer part of where the bearing's encased in it. So I guess what we're going to have to do is, once we're all done here, we're going to have to drive the car up on ramp so that the weight of the car is on the suspension, and going to have to loosen these bolts, let it kind of go to where it wants, and then tighten it back up so the rubber's not stretched all the time whenever it is sitting normally. Alright, well, the control arms are both as tight as they're getting for now. This one's tight just to hold the cross member up, and we're just going to get the motor mount nuts on, and then we can get that bracket bolted back up all the way, and the rack in, and the alternator in, and the rack plate on, and the wheels on, and then we got to put oil in the car, and then maybe it'll run still and not fall apart. Yeah. So the alternator's back on. I have to get the bushings in the steering rack. So we've got Delrin ones. Hopefully they'll just be able to squeeze in with some channel locks. Alright, everything is bolted back on underneath. Rack plate, rack, bushing, sway bar, control arms, tow hooks. So time to see if the engine stays up. Alright, so yeah, there's the picture from before. Intake was 50 millimeters below the brace. Now we're not quite 30. I guess the car is all bolted together on the ground. Right, Zach?
Mm-hmm.
So now I gotta oil it up. And then hopefully it'll start and not catch fire, and yeah. Okay, time for the moment of truth. See if hooking up the battery catches anything on fire. We got a light. Don't hear no sparks. Nothing smoldering. So we got oil up to full on the dipstick. I did fill the filter ahead of time, but we'll see. Probably need some more. Oh, it's running. And before, it wouldn't rock at all when you hit the gas. Moves now. Oh, you can see here the engine will rock now. No more solid motor mounts.